Why does God allow suffering? I'm sure we've all asked that question at times, whether we're a Jesus follower or not. Suffering often doesn't seem to make sense. So today we're looking at how we can find hope when suffering leaves us with loads of questions that are difficult to answer or get our head around. This is the third and the final talk in our series on finding hope in a hopeless place. If you haven't seen the earlier messages, you can catch up at fbcnext.com, and it will be good to do that to get the whole picture. A lot of people assume that God cannot be both good and all-powerful if he allows suffering. God can't be all-loving and all-powerful. If he's loving, he would want to end suffering, and if he's powerful, he could. And God hasn't ended suffering, so he can't be both loving and powerful. This is one of the major objections to faith and trust in God. Stephen Fry, who is patron of Humanists UK, has said that if he ever met God, he would challenge God to explain the terrible pain of bone cancer in children. And this is typical of the argument that many have. Unless God can explain suffering, then he must be either bad or indifferent. And who would want to know a God like that? Who could hope in a God like that? God must explain it or be dismissed as either uncaring or non-existent. Well, this is exactly the challenge that a man called Job gave to God thousands of years ago. It's written up in the book of Job, one of the most ancient books in the Bible. We've been tracking Job's journey through pain and loss and how he's held on to his hope in God. Job was a man who experienced severe loss and pain. He lost his family, his possessions, and his health. His suffering went on and on, with an appalling skin condition that caused festering boils to break out all over his body. And although he wasn't perfect, we're told he was basically a good and upright guy who hadn't done anything wrong to deserve all this. Job is the classic example of a person who suffers where it doesn't seem to make sense. Yet Job continued to trust God and to hope in God, that God would somehow bring him through this terrible time. What I find authentic about Job is that he complained a lot. He said it was all very unjust and demanded God justify why he was allowing it. He wanted to know why God is so illogical, allowing good people to suffer, why pain is allowed to cause so much grief, why God has allowed the world to go wrong in such a desperately bad way. He wanted to have it out with God and demanded that God explain. And that's exactly how we feel, isn't it? We want to ask God the Stephen Fry question. What about bone cancer in children then? We feel like Job felt, that God must either explain himself or be dismissed. Well, right at the end of the story of Job, God shows up, and it's a moment of high drama. God appears in a whirlwind, which is symbolic of great power and must have been pretty scary. But one of the interesting things about a whirlwind is that right at the centre, the eye of the storm is completely quiet. From the centre of the storm, Job hears the voice of God speaking with him. And we lean forward in expectation to overhear what God has to say for himself. But instead of answering Job's questions, instead of giving Job any explanation, God asks Job some questions. Actually, over 60 questions that come out of this whirlwind. God says, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." And God's first question to Job is this: "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand." Well, this must have been literally mind-blowing. I mean, apart from the physical awesomeness of the whirlwind, God's question is unanswerable. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Well, Job wasn't anywhere. He didn't even exist. And then God goes on to question Job about the sky at night. And he uses the names of the star groups to talk to Job about the galaxies. "Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades," he says. "Can you loosen Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons? Or lead out the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? In other words, are you in charge of gravity, quantum mechanics and the space-time continuum, Job? And by now, we have the impression that Job is definitely regretting asking God to show up. But God goes on, piling on mind-numbing question after question. I'm compressing it here because, we don't have time. Take a look at yourself in Job chapter 38 onwards. God's questions encompass the whole of creation, right from the macro universe down to the micro habits of animals. One of his questions is, do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Which suggests that God knows the detail of every living thing. And then God points to the exceptional power in some of the great beasts, showing how comparatively limited human strength is. And then after this whirlwind of questions, God puts his finger on the real issue. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Ouch. This one gets to the heart of it. Job wanted to talk to God because he was convinced God was being unjust. But if we demand God justify himself, we put ourselves above God, effectively passing judgment on God. We put God down in order to justify our own opinion. We make ourselves into God. And as if to ridicule that, God says to Job, do you have an arm like God's, and can your voice thunder like his? Then adorn yourself with glory and splendour and clothe yourself in honour and majesty. In other words, Job, if you think you're God, then start acting like it. God poses impossible question after impossible question until Job recognises that he is completely, totally out of his depth. He can't answer any of God's questions, and the process is making him realise that his own limited perspective, his own limited capacity is part of the problem. He doesn't have the capability to understand the complexity and depth of the issue he's raised with God. His mind is inadequate to comprehend the scope of the answer. Job is left with the realisation that he's tried to box a vastly superior being into his own frame of reference, and it can't be done. Job is not God to make the final determination. God is God. And the process of being exposed to God's questions and just a part of his majesty completely overwhelms Job with the knowledge that he is the one who is out of order. And from a posture of anger towards God for what he perceived as injustice that doesn't make sense, Job now completely changes to a posture of humility. All his rage is gone, all his questions are gone, blown away by God. And in their place is a quiet acceptance that he must embrace his own finite smallness in the arms of his infinite God, his God, in whom he still trusts and in whom he can hope. Then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this who obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer me. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. And when Job says he despises himself, he means he despises the way in which he's tried to challenge God. And when he says that he's now seen God, he means he's finally seen more clearly the greatness of God. And in the face of that greatness, he lets go of his anger. He repents, he changes his mind about God, and he changes his attitude. And all this makes me realise that I've got to stop trying to hold God to account. My understanding, my capability is insufficient for that. If I insist on God answering to me, I've made my own understanding my God. Then my intellect has become my idol. I have to let go of the idea that I can assess God, because I can't. It's not realistic or honest to claim that I can. Now, the cynic will say, well, that's all terribly convenient for God, isn't it? I mean, I may not have the capability to deal with an answer to suffering, but I still have to deal with the pain. God doesn't have to answer for the pain I'm going through, but I'm still in pain nonetheless. Suffering makes me angry with God because for whatever reason he has allowed me and others to go through pain. And pain hurts. And the anger I feel about it damages my trust and hope in God. Well, you know, the only way out of feeling anger and resentment is to let it go. You have to let it go. God has done nothing wrong, but by allowing pain and suffering, God has allowed me to be hurt. And it's that hurt that I need to forgive. And I think that's what Job did as he realised the greatness of God. He released God from his anger and his bitterness. He released God from all the expectations he had of God that were not met. He despised himself for having those expectations, those attitudes, and he let them go. And as he let that negative anger and bitterness go, even though there was still a lot he didn't understand, he was free again to trust that God loved him. He could see God more clearly without that red mist of his anger. God never gave Job a direct answer to his questions. I guess you could say that the way God answered Job was with a revelation of his greatness, and in that revelation, Job was finally satisfied. When we see a problem in front of God, the problem can seem huge. Job's suffering seemed huge to him. Our suffering seems huge to us. But when we focus on God, choosing to put God in front of the problem, it changes our perspective. Choosing to focus on God rather than ourselves changes our perspective. You may be going through a very tough time at present. A lot of people are, and suffering is very real. It's not just an intellectual issue. Our pain may be physical pain, emotional pain, or grief, or mental pressure. Whatever it is hard. This isn't about minimizing the pain you feel. But if your pain is causing you to feel resentment towards God, that compounds the pain, because anger and resentment hinder your ability to trust in God and have hope in him. If we can let go of any anger and bitterness or resentment against God, if we can let God off our hook, so to speak, then we're on the pathway back to hope. As we release God from our expectations, as we recognise that his greatness is beyond our understanding, then we will be free to trust and hope in him again. You can do that in prayer. Just tell God you're hurting bad, but you accept he does know best, and so you let go of any resentment. God can take you yelling at him, you know. Job did. If you need to tell God exactly how you're feeling, go right ahead. He can take it. That's what Jesus did. Even Jesus didn't fully understand suffering, because on the cross, as he took the punishment for all our sin, in his terrible pain, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" His experience did not make sense to him at the time, even to him. And Jesus was God in the flesh. After uttering that cry of desolation, Jesus then said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," showing that his hope was still in his Father God, even though it felt like God had forsaken him. If you want to know what God is really like, look at Jesus, God in the flesh. Look at the gospel biographical accounts of the life of Jesus and the way he was. He was compassionate, a healer, a man who pursued what was right and always did what was right. He was inspirational, he was loving and self-sacrificing. He is God's Son, and he said, "I and the Father are one." That's how we know what God is like, and that's how we know he is worthy of our trust. In the resurrection of Jesus, we see that transformation and renewal follows or even flows out of suffering. There is something about suffering that is not just negative or a thing that gets in the way of life, but is in fact a pathway through which we can become transformed and eventually renewed. Well, I'm pleased to tell you that the end of Job's story is a happy one. He forgives his friends who accused him, and God restores to Job everything he had lost, in fact twice as much as he had lost. Job finally reaches a place of healing and peace after his long ordeal. Not everyone reaches that place in this life, but those who trust and hope in God will reach it eventually. I wish I could tie up this message with a neat promise that all will be well next week and that any suffering you're experiencing will soon be over. I can't. But the story of Job shows us that although God allows suffering, he never leaves us on our own. His Spirit is with you. And if we hang on to God and draw near to God in prayer, we can persevere and we can grow in character. There is mystery in suffering. What matters is hanging on to your relationship with God and keeping your hope in Him, as Job did and as Jesus did. Choosing to put our hope in God is like putting on a helmet in a battle. In fact, the Bible refers to the hope of salvation as a helmet. A helmet protects the head, which is symbolic of the mind. Hope in God is a defense against being brought low in our mental state, which can so often be the effect of suffering. Some years ago, a young girl called Helen Keller was born with normal eyesight and hearing. She said her first words before the age of 1. But she became deaf, blind and mute at 19 months after an illness that doctors now think may have been meningitis or scarlet fever. She came to accept her suffering and eventually wrote, "I thank God for my handicaps, for through them I have found myself, my work and my God." We have hope in God because this life is not all there is. There is more to come, and for the believer in Jesus Christ, that future is better. We may be wasting away outwardly, but inwardly we are being renewed by the hope of a better life to come. And that hope is based on the fact of the resurrection of Jesus and the promise of God to raise everyone from the dead. That is the ultimate hope that keeps our hearts and minds protected from despair. Jesus is the hope and the anchor for our souls. Finding Jesus is finding hope.